Part 2 of Fashion Merchandising Principles and Practice covers the running case study that demonstrates the fashion merchandiser role. It does this over 5 chapters, starting with an introductory positioning chapter that details the situation facing the fictitious company that the case study will cover, and finishes in chapter 10 with the tidying up of a newly created fashion range through sizing activities and allocation planning. Now, today, fashion ranges benefit from the opportunity for fashion retailers to utilize a wide range of data to make decisions, a range of distribution channels, whether they be physical stores or physical and online stores, or pure play online, or aggregators, third-party retailers, to sell a product range once it has been created. Now, all of those will do things in different ways. We have to accept that there's no single absolute finite process with which a product range is created, but they all have something in common in that they all adhere to the same basic principles and activities, despite the disparity in the way that they take their product to market. And as such, it seems sensible for this running case study to base it in the basic principles. That's all we can do in the book. And as such, it provides a template for you to understand the process, the terminology used, the core activities, decision points, and metrics that go into the creation of a range, but that's all it can do. The challenge then to you is to take that up, those basic principles, and then apply the contextual use of that information within whatever retail organization or role that you work in. Now, the first contentious thing that I decided was to base the fictitious case study on a physical store, a single location. And I did that because that was the broadest form of retailing, because you have not only the requirements of creating financial budgets, you also have the requirements of understanding product data and creating KPI budgets. You also have the standard challenge of turning those KPI budgets into an open to buy and then into a range plan. But you also have the added requirement to consider the space that you have. How is this product going to look within store? And while we have physical stores, and I'm very confident that physical stores will find a way to re-emerge in a more positive way in the not too distant future, we have to keep that within the planning process. Otherwise, we are going to make decisions that are myopically finance focused rather than finance and how the product is going to be presented in a physical environment. The second point I would like to make is that the case study, as I said, is fictitious, and as such, the numbers, while they add up and they make sense through a process perspective, they are not necessarily commercially viable in a real life context. And that's because I had to make some presumptions on your behalf to prevent the case study from becoming too big. But also I had to amplify some of the decisions and some of the numbers that were used to help emphasize points within the book. So I do not claim that these numbers have integrity in a real world context. Any business that uses the numbers will probably go bust very fast, but they are there for a shape. They are there to give you an idea of how you can take a number of different metrics and almost like in a Rubik cube form, twist and turn, decide, cut, slice, dice, and change the shape into a new one for the season ahead. So let's have a think about part 2. Chapter 5 is the first chapter in this part, and this provides a contextual review of the situation facing the fictitious Prentice Day menswear business based in London's Oxford Street. It provides an overview of the challenges facing the business and the actions that the merchandiser would take to first just understand what's going on. And that contextual position is really just saying, well, how much money do we make and how efficient are we at making that money? And that gives us a position, that gives us something that we can shape and benchmark everything around for the future chapters. Chapter 6 then looks at 2 forms of history analysis. Firstly, budgetary analysis, where we look and see what financial contribution the range made to the business across a number of core metrics. There are more, but I've kept it to the core metrics. And then also how the product range performed itself. And I've looked at 3 product metrics, sell-through rate, rate of sale, and average cover or week's cover as part of that analysis. And the melding of the contextual analysis from chapter 5 into the product and budgetary analysis in chapter 6 allows the merchandiser to create a strategy, to create a plan, to say, well, this is what worked, this is what didn't work, and this is what we now have to ensure is put in place when we put the new range together. Chapter 7 starts to take that base and create a financial plan. From chapter 2, you will know that the merchandiser activities are very connected to the role of finance within the organisation, because the product range is the retailer's route to wealth creation. And therefore, the first stage, once you've done the an analytical understanding of what happened last year, is to then translate those numbers along with a strategy plan into a financial budget. That financial budget, if it's in a large organisation, will then be rolled up with other departments' numbers being added to it and sent through to the finance team, who will then check it over and look at it from a cash flow perspective. Are the plans that the teams have going to enable us to generate cash? Look at it from a sales and profit perspective, but also look at it from a balance sheet perspective. Are we putting too much risk in stock, perhaps, by the plans that we have? That financial budget creates the shape, and that shape is what drives the range planning process from the perspective of the merchandiser. But to get there, we have to then take one little step, which actually is very simple, but can be met with a great deal of fear. I've no idea why. I certainly never felt that when I was in industry. But firstly, we need to understand the amount of money that we can spend on product that is afforded by the budgets we've created. That's really simple. That's creating the open to buy, and that identifies a single, or it could be at department level, value that the buyer can spend up to but can't go above. Ideally will come below at this stage, but that is the connection between the range plan and the budgets. As long as the range plan fits within that overall open to buy, which feeds from the budget process, we know that the product range will fit within its financial criteria. However, of course, we don't want to spend all of our open to buy, all of our buying budget in one go. We also don't want to spend it all at the beginning of the season. We don't want to bring all of our stock in week 1 and then sit and watch it sell over the next 20 weeks or so. That's not how the fashion consumer works. Fast fashion has changed that, and we need regular drops of stock. So the more tricky part of manipulating the open to buy is to create the weekly sales and stock intake report, the WSSI, or as a lot of people like to call it, the WSI. And that can be tricky. And chapter 8 details a very simplistic way of creating a WSSI and taking that open to buy and phasing it over each week of the season so that you can have regular drops of stock from week 1 of the season to the last full price week, whenever that may be. With that in place, chapter 9 then looks at the range planning process from the merchandiser's perspective and takes some of the open to buy that's created in chapter 8 and demonstrates how that can be converted into a product range that is balanced, both in terms of number of units bought per option type, but also balanced in terms of margin, because each product will comprise different fabrications, different trim, different embellishments. It will also have a different salience or relevance to a consumer, and so there are different price points and different cost of make, or there are different landed cost prices as well, if say you're buying something from the Far East and then something from Turkey. Therefore, the range planning process from the merchandiser's process is to ensure that the range is balanced. There's a balance of metrics and a balance in the units that are bought, and chapter 9 demonstrates that. The final chapter in the running case study is chapter 10, which then takes the final range plan and says, well, what do we do with this? Apart from saying, well, we've got a range, we have to then make it, and we then have to ensure that it is bought from supplier and provided to the consumer in a way that is appropriate to both. And here we look at the relationship between the merchandiser and the supplier and the flow of stock into the business. We also look at how to create size curves or size ratios. We also look at allocation plans and how to determine how much stock should be allocated of each option prior to the start of the season. And that's it. That is the sum of part 2. It represents about a third of the book, and it's the only part of the book that has any really meaningful maths and calculations within it. Having said that, it's presenting a single viewpoint of a single product type, menswear, in a single location in London, at a single point in time. The principles will hold true, but the way that you make the decisions on what looks right and what looks wrong will always be different every season, every week, every month, every year. And I would stress that the contextual understanding that's positioned in chapter 5 is possibly the most important part of the planning process, because without that context, without knowing why you are doing something, what is the reason for us undertaking these activities, then nothing else really makes sense. So I would encourage you to consider that final point and certainly engage with chapter 5 in a deep way, because without that, the rest of the chapters may at times seem a little bit theoretical. Okay, enjoy.